Hello, welcome to this Sunday edition of It's Logical. This time we explore the emerging user psyches. I'm not using the word consumer psyches because then it becomes very business-like. Because what these guys have done is really getting to know individuals as human beings. Because consumers are humans first, and then they become consumers. So let's be human first,
Yeah.
and look at how people are going to kind of what are the kind of keys or mental models that will emerge from this once we are in the lockdown and getting out of the lockdown slowly. Things are going to change, behaviors are going to change, etc. And what implications does it have on society and business also? That's what we will explore through these 45 minutes of chat. So welcome. We have a very strong interdisciplinary panel. Let me start by introducing all of you. Anju Joseph is the consumer insighting specialist with a deep understanding of psychology, sociology, and behavioral economics. She's currently the head of Quantum Business, the business head of Quantum, and a partner with QCS. Aftab Kaushik is a historian and a cultural anthropologist by training, and brings his deep knowledge about culture shifts across the globe into brand strategy. He is currently a partner at Quantum India. And Madhav Srinivas is a brand strategy expert, great with human insights, has worked across South Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, all of them bring in close to 60 plus years of experience between them. So get ready for an exciting kind of discussion. So my first question, just to kind of get the audience familiar with what you guys do at Quantum Consumer Solutions. So just about a little bit about your work, and then we will get into the details of this particular report that we're going to talk about. So just what are the kind of stuff that
I can begin.
Yeah.
Firstly, thanks for that, Kaustubh. We are super excited to be here. Good morning to everybody who's joining in on a Sunday. So thank you so much for being here. Very briefly about what we do. Like you said, we're a human insights company, and we look to understand people. It's as simple as that, as complex as that. And we, and exactly like how you described, I think we very carefully stay away from defining it as user insight or consumer insight, with all due respect to those terms, because we think that there is a larger space, larger complexity of trying to understand the human condition. And that's where the really powerful insights come from, when you go beyond looking at people as simply consumers and in framing them in a very narrow lens. So we look to kind of go beyond that, and we look to then translate that into solutions for brands. So that's really what we do.
Just to add to that, I think we see ourselves as sense makers. We say that there's so much information, there is so much that's available out there, and somebody needs to make sense of it for the human being. So with the human at the center, we believe that the work that we do is one of sense making.
Great. Wonderful.
And we study the present and the past to look towards the future. So we're always passing time.
Yeah. Coming from the historian.
That's right.
So kind of this kind of captures that fundamental principle of design thinking, so to say, being absolutely human-centered before really looking at the human as a consumer. Great. So, nowadays, a lot of people have been publishing a lot of reports of what is happening and what will happen, etc., etc., etc. But when I went through the deck that you had sent to me, I immediately felt this is a little different from what's being dished out there. So, out of the zillions of reports being generated, how is this report different? So your views on this. Go on.
So Kaustav, thank you for that observation, because that's a great validation of what we've done. Because you are such an expert yourself, and you're dealing with so many companies, and working in that space. We feel that there are amazing reports out there. There are exciting reports talking about finances, talking about macro scenarios as well as consumption and so on and so forth. Three things we believe differentiates our report from all other reports out there. One is the fact that the starting point has been what you may call inside out. So you've started with the human. The disciplines you've accessed are, I think, different. You've looked at psychology of the human being. You've looked at the culture that he operates in, and you've looked at sciences like behavioral economics to understand really what this crisis means, because currently it is a crisis of meaning. So we've studied it from a social sciences lens, and I think that's the first differentiator. The other differentiator we believe is that it is crafted for actionability. So anybody who's dealing with human beings in a transactional way, in a business capacity, or in other ways, this report actually gives you very, very actionable direction in terms of what you need to do in the present. And the third thing is, I think, the people who worked on it. So three of us are here, but we also have three more partners of the India business who worked on this deck. So the people bring in very different lenses to the work. So I think these three things fundamentally, we believe, separates this report from anything else that is out there.
If I can just add to what Anju is saying as well, Kaustav, which is that I think that we've taken a very clear position on what to look for and what to study at this point, which is that we've stayed away from really looking at this as purely tracking consumer behavior, nor are we simply trying to crystal ball gaze into the future to sit here and try and predict what's going to happen. We've looked at this as a supremely influential period in the life of the consumer. I think this is a very pivotal moment in our lives and in society, because it brings together the confluence of three very large forces to play. One is obviously that of the disease, but there is also a massive economic crisis at play. And thirdly, there is a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding. And we think that when all these three come together, like Anju says, there is a meaning crisis. There's a crisis of meaning that the Indian people, the Indian citizen experience. So fundamentally, what we've said is that this is leading to certain old attitudes getting disrupted, old ways of thinking getting disrupted, and some new values or new attitudes emerging from this. And we've kind of said that our way of thinking about this is almost to imagine the consumer like plasticine, that the consumer is moldable perhaps at this point, is under the, is subject to a lot of influence. I think we can go back to the earlier one, Aditya. And therefore, we've simply tried to look at what are the new formations at the moment. And we think that is going to be the essence of creating value in the lives of our TGs, people, consumers, call them what you will. But I think if you really, as brands and organizations targeting these people, have need to create relevance and resonance that's going to come from being able to understand these fundamental new formations.
I just want to say also that we often use the word unprecedented when we describe this crisis, and we in this image that you're looking at, we've said never before seen events. It's true there have been pandemics in the past. The 1918 pandemic is a great parallel to what we're going through right now. That was a period where you had the disease, you also had recession, you had humanitarian crises. If you go further back in history, you've had the plagues, you've had similar situations. Why is today's crisis unprecedented? For two reasons. I think the world is more connected. We've never had this type of a triangulation of impacts in a world as connected as we are today. And this connectedness, this globalization means that there is a level of information exchange that has never before been possible. And while we were creating the deck, we were talking about the fact that running in parallel to the pandemic is an infodemic. So there is this massive exchange of information. Some of it is fact, some of it is fiction. And it's being shared across geographies. People are influencing each other. There is hysteria, there is panic, there is new solutions, there are new ideas on both sides, negative and positive. There's this huge inundation of people's minds with information. And that is causing this moment to be a absolutely unique moment in time. And while it is deeply distressing and deeply difficult and tragic in many ways, it's also a deeply significant moment. It is truly an inflection point in modern history. We will talk about this as we have a chat today, but it is a golden opportunity for brands and people to reorient themselves, to change the way we're living. It's a moment of invaluable introspection, and in a sense, we were discussing this some time back, but it's an opportunity for rebirth, not just an opportunity, rebirth of society, civilization, humanity, people, brands. All of that is coming. It's coming 6 months from now. The question is, are we going to continue to be the way we were? Are we going to try to return to the past? Or are we actually going to create something new out of all of this? Innovation, this is the time for you.
Yeah.
And again, I think Aftab really touched upon something super important, because if you consider this phase as the gestation period for the new normal that is eventually going to come, what is happening now is pretty much going to be core to some of the DNA that you'll see in society in time to come as part of that new normal. So on the one hand, yes, it is an opportunity, but it is also a great point in trying to understand and reflect on what our responsibility is as brands and as marketers and as people, because there is a very sobering effect this whole crisis has had, right? I mean, as I personally sit here, I think it has made me really aware of the kind of excesses in my own life, and the general apathy that is there in society, the incredible kind of inequality that is there for us to witness. So I think it's as much an opportunity as it is a space for responsibility for brands as well.
Yeah. Just to add to what Madhav is saying, like one of the most probably startling things that one saw is how quickly Mother Nature recovered, right? Like when we started behaving ourselves, suddenly the air was cleaner, the dolphins were back, you could see the Mount Everest, things that actually you had to travel many, many, many kilometers to experience and enjoy was available to us, was presented to us and what that tells us is, Mother Nature is so benevolent as well. You treat her well just for a little while and look at what you can reap. So I think it's really a watershed moment.
I'm facing the window right now and I can see the blue sky in Mumbai.
Yeah.
But a decade and a half, I have not seen anything other than grey in Mumbai.
Or the stars at night.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you can imagine what it's like for me in Delhi. If you actually see a sky. Yeah.
I'm telling you, so now I can actually finally show my children stars in the sky rather than just in a book.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So that triangle which you displayed some time back, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's a pandemic, as well as it's a economic crisis. Now, that's something in a connected world. I mean, if you were to decode an individual, the person is fearful about his or her health coming in contact with someone. He or she is fearful about where is my next paycheck going to come from, if at all. And if at all it is going to come, it is going to be shrinked. It is going to be shrunk. And God forbid I get infected. How are people around me going to react? So it's kind of a combination of fear psychosis in terms of health, economics, as well as social stigma. So from that, what kinds of mentalities will emerge, which I think is the focal point of your your report. Could you guys elaborate on that? What are the kind of mental models, so to say, that are emerging?
Yeah, absolutely. Aditya, could I request you to show us this slide? Yeah. So actually, this is a pretty important, kind of chart for you to look at. What we've identified through studying a lot of these attitudes, which Anju described earlier, is looking at the psychology and the cultural experience of the consumer of this crisis. We found there were three ways in which this crisis or the crises were being interpreted and experienced. The first was really as an external threat. What you can see in the green box is really as an external threat, where the sense of danger is coming from outside in. That could be about infection, it could be about somebody who's representing a source of threat to me. The second is really the resultant life disruptions. How does it disrupt what used to be my old normal? How did it completely come and revamp this? So, I mean, right from the fact there's a lockdown to the fact that I've been deprived of a number of things that I'd taken for granted. How is my life losing its kind of balance? It's creating and perpetuating a sense of helplessness in that way. And the third is really in terms of how this entire crisis is creating new perspectives. It's not simply a here and now sense of disruption, but there is also an outlook that is changing, and that really is about the view of the future, the sense of worry, how we adapting ourselves. I mean, we are a pretty adaptable society, and as a culture, we've been through a lot of struggles in the past. And this is again going to shape our thinking and our ability to fight back in a unique way. So these are the three fundamental lenses through which we've looked at the crises. And within each of these, we've identified that there are 9 different types of mental models. And they're listed here. I won't call each of these out. But maybe what we can do is walk you through some of these as we go along. Should we do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Kaustav, just to add to what Madhav said, so we are not saying these are different kinds of people who are experiencing these different minds, right? Like every human being might be going through 1 or 2 or 3 of these, at a given point in time. It could be during a day I might experience, any of these. So it's not really a consumer segmentation, but really what are the various kinds of experiences that the consumer is having given the current crises.
Yeah, and this is where it's important to kind of understand the so to say user journeys, not just related to one product or service, but the user journey. I mean, like a day in the life of, or a month in the life of, those kinds of things. And if you can get those, the fact that people shift from one mindset to the other within maybe 2-3 minutes or within maybe 2-3 hours. And if one kind of gets that, I think there's a lot of value in what you're saying. Then how can governments, businesses, after having understood this, what are the triggers that need to be, or rather, what are the pulses, or where should the finger be put on?
Absolutely.
Kaustav, which is that if you consider something like the panic mind, which is one of the mental models and probably one of the primary mental models, because this entire crisis is an experience of threat. And we've seen that this has resulted in a number of manifestations, right from the very sad sight of migrants just fleeing urban cities back to villages whatever be the cost, right? They've really fled at great peril to themselves, simply as a matter of removing themselves from what they thought of as a site of danger. But the truth is, and there are many other manifestations, it would be completely inaccurate to think that the stage of panic is over. Panic can be triggered again. I mean, as recently as yesterday, in one of our WhatsApp groups, the many WhatsApp groups that we're connected on, somebody sent out a message about there's going to be again a bit of a lockdown. There's going to be no availability of certain kinds of supplies, etc. And immediately the response was frantic. And this frenetic behavior, whether in terms of what you've seen in the West is toilet paper hoarding, and in India it's other kind of stockpiling that you're seeing, is very reflective of this. And therefore it's not simply a stage to pass through. These are in the air and can be triggered based on the kind of stimulus that one is exposed to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Madhav, I should point out that yesterday in Beijing, apparently, they've identified a new market outbreak.
Yes. So
And if you look at the way the government is reacting in China, in Beijing, again, it's a triggering of a panic response to the fact that, wow, we may have that second wave.
Yeah.
So it's exactly that. It's about consumers and people and governments cycling through these states of mind, these mental models. Like you said, could be during a day, could be over a period of 2 weeks, could be over the next few months. What we do know for India is that we're looking at least 6 to 9 months of these mental models definitely being prevalent as we go.
Costa, I just wanted to point out one more thing. Like, I think some of our clients, the question has been, okay, so if there are these 9 mental models, then what do I do, right? Like, but I think the point also is that it is a time for choice making. All these are relevant, and therefore what you choose to solve is also something that using the study gives you. So one is to say, I'm overwhelmed by all of this, and the consumer is going through so much. The other is to say that as a brand that wants to actually create meaning in the consumer's life in this new world, what is it that I can do? And so you could actually choose from these 9 that are available to say, you know what, I can authentically solve this and this.
Correct.
So I think that way it's very empowering as well as a document.
Yeah. So let's go through the.
Go on.
Let's quickly visit some of these.
Madhav spoke about the panic mind.
Yes.
Now, can you walk us through the others? I mean, get back to that slide. Those slides. That will be interesting to understand.
Aditya? Yeah, thanks. So this is the distancing mind. Now, when we say distancing mind, what we're talking about is not merely the physical distance or separation of people from the contagion point of view. Yes, that. But this is also about the idea of othering. In a moment of crisis, what really seems to be happening is that we are, especially a crisis like this, where we're grappling with what's happening. It's a very confusing experience. And you need to make the enemy visible. You need to make sense of it in very simple black and white ways. To put it very simply and bluntly, you need to be able to point the finger in someone and say, that's the source of the problem. And that is what the idea of othering is about. What we've seen already, and both at a global level in terms of the xenophobic outbreaks in, right from Donald Trump to our own kind of ban on Chinese products or boycott of Chinese products, to the treatment of the Northeast citizens, or what we've seen as the Muslim community in India kind of experience, are signs of this blaming of the other and the othering, which gets triggered particularly when there is a hard to grapple with kind of crisis like this.
Yeah, there's a need to kind of fortify inwards. People gravitate. Sorry, say again.
Or find a cause.
Find a cause.
Find an
always outside.
Yes,
that's what you mean by distancing mind.
Yes, but also a very strong tribal instinct, which is to say, I need to go back to the people I know, where I feel safe. I need to band together. I need to become a tighter group in myself. And I wanted to bring to our attention something we've known about social media, for example, for the longest time, which is that if you spend a lot of time on your news feeds, the algorithm of your news feed basically becomes an echo chamber for your own views.
Correct.
And it allows you to reinforce stereotypes that you have about other people. So the more you spend time in your own little bubble, the more you start to truly believe that the other is all the bad things that you expected them to be, right? And I think the experience of the pandemic in its tribal power is forcing us to engage only with each other, the ones we are safe with. And it's increasing the distance between us and others, right? And if everybody looks now and looks at what happened in the US, racism has been there for centuries, right? But spark this triggering of incidents of racial violence are no coincidence. They are a function of this distance that's growing and the crystallization of stereotypes that have always existed. What is so heartening to see is the response to that racism, which again I want to say is not a coincidence. It is a product of the time we are in right now, where people have the mind space, they have the honestly the unemployment and the underemployment to actually take cognizance of what has happened and react to it and protest against it. So, like we said earlier, this is a plasticine moment in history. This is a clay moment in history. Uh, Things that are happening now will happen with a pace that is unlikely to be matched, in recent times or in times to come. So yeah. So that's a little bit on distancing.
Kind of, what I can summarize it as is, instead of people becoming open, they might become insular.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah,
Actually,
that's the difference in mind.
yeah, if you just look closer home, look at how people are responding to their help at home. And it's almost so, even though it's an rich man brought the disease in, today who's being othered is the poorer sections, people who are less privileged, and that's all a reflection of this what Aftab called as the othering mind, right? So you are seeking to create cohorts who are like yourself,
Right.
and you feel safe in that.
Great. So yeah, distance in mind. So what's the third?
Third, Madhav.
The third is the victim mind. Maybe again,
The victim mind. Okay.
Yes.
the victim mind. I mean, see,
Why
I
do-
think one of the core experiences of a crisis is to be able to broadcast your suffering. I think everybody has suffered, right? It's not only the migrant. I think in different degrees, people have had a shared experience of suffering, and in more ways than we can understand. I mean, if you take the homemaker, for instance, she's had a real breakdown of the home in what may have initially started off as a little bit of a holiday imagination, soon mushroomed into a monster that you never anticipated, right?
Yeah.
So home, for instance, has become almost a hotel of sorts where the guests never check out and you don't have any staff to help you with. And if you look at the unemployment scenario, I mean, like, a lot of hardworking people who've done their very best, given their all, have lost their jobs. They've had salary cuts, and so there is a great sense of injustice that people are experiencing, and there's a feeling of victimhood at this point, which is large, and therefore for brands, this is a time of empathy. This is a time to kind of be able to show that acknowledgement and support the people that you're talking with and communicating with, because the most offensive thing a brand can perhaps do at this point is dismiss their suffering as not equal or not adequate, or simply to kind of tide over it. I think that process of simply helping people feel like they're heard, they're understood, is a very, very critical one for brands to engage in.
So what you're saying is uh, there is a tendency to kind of wallow in self-pity. Why me? Self-pity.
Absolutely.
So okay.
And
And people are going to go through these kinds of changes in their, I mean, the mind states of mind. All right, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So Kaustav, I think the other big opportunity for brands here is really innovation, because, you're being faced with problems that you didn't really experience earlier, or, you're finding that victimhood in spaces that you weren't really privy to earlier. And therefore, innovation as an idea is a very powerful one in this state. As a victim, I'm looking for the hero, that my knight in shining armor, and brands can actually very ably play that role.
So interesting. Yeah, okay. So what's the next one? The fourth one?
The fourth one is what we call the infantilized mind.
Okay.
I think this image is very telling. It's probably etched in public memory, which is a very almost, if you consider the semiotics of this, the relationship between the state and the people is almost a teacher-child, parent-child kind of transaction that's happening, right? It's the scale and size of this crisis, of course, is well understood, but the kind of position in which we've asked the people to be is a very infantile one. Given the size of the crisis, people automatically are regressing to say it's beyond my ability to deal with, but also it's an imposed state by saying, listen, I want you to do nothing. Okay, just don't do anything stupid. I mean, if you've seen all those videos of cops going and scaring people and wearing COVID style helmets and things like that, it's a parent child interaction. And at the core of it, it's not only force, but also something people feel from within. And at this point, we think that people are seeking a parent. People are seeking a fair, legitimate parent with who can lead them with conviction. So whether that's going to be again the state, whether it's going to be organizations or brands, that's what they're looking for. There is, of course, another side of it where there are some rebellious children who are looking to escape the firm grip of this a draconian parent, let me say. And so there is that as well. But that really is what the infantilized mind is about.
And it's a necessary stage.
Yeah.
You need to go through infantilization, one from a state perspective, because obedience is and control is easier to exercise when you have infantilized the population. And that is a necessary thing that was required, for example, during lockdown. But following that, there's rebirth, there's infantilization, and then there is a movement into adolescence, where now the state narrative is Atmanirbhar, which is almost like saying, okay, time to grow up, time to emerge out of this infantile state and take charge. And so this is a process of rebirth. This is we will see this longer trajectory from infantilization to self-sufficiency, which we'll talk about in a little time from now. But we should see it as a trajectory.
So, infantilization in terms of Madhav and Aftab, you mentioned that somebody putting rules for you. Right. I look at it a slightly other perspective, is that a person with so many things happening around me, feels helpless, and then gets into an infantile stage. Ki, boss, now I can't do anything. Please tell me what to do.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying? So that's where the communication of the brands or companies could be tailored to that.
Absolutely. So we are saying that, yeah,
to make that person feel less helpless.
Yes.
Completely.
Okay,
in fact, Kaustav, it can be hypothesized that even the act of migration is like, a feeling that I have been abandoned. The parent who was to look after me has abandoned me, and and so one is, of course, the sense of strongest stability comes from the sacred canopy, which is your home, but the other is also like, what has the government done for me, or what has what has the employer who I was employed with done for me, and therefore I'm going away. So that could be interpreted as an infantile response as well.
And that's where the messaging kind of from companies needs to be modulated. All right. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. So the next one.
Anju, you want to walk them through the imprisoned mind?
Yeah. So I think if you look at it, Kaustav, the entire narrative of this whole crisis has been one of war. Right? Like, so you've used words, media has been full of war metaphors. You've used words like lockdown, right? Like, and you have banned things. You have told me what to do, told me what not to do. So what is...
Frontline warriors also, no?
Sorry? Yeah, and warriors, COVID warriors, and all of that. So what you fundamentally impinged on for the consumer is the freedom that the consumer took for granted. The human being took for granted, right? And I think that's what the imprisoned mind focuses on. So one is the physical imprisonment, but also the other one is the imprisonment of therefore, what I can experience what I can engage with, who I can engage with, how I can engage, all of it. So my freedom being completely taken away from me at various levels is what this mind talks about.
And
You know,
there are two big manifestations. One is monotony,
Yeah.
Groundhog Day. This repetition of the sameness in our lives, sameness of routines, because we don't have the ability to access stimuli outside
Yeah.
of our homes, and
Absolutely.
that's been curtailed to a great extent. So the one is monotony, the other is sheer congestion. I mean, if we think about India, it's not just a Bombay phenomenon. The majority of our country does not have the luxury of living
Right.
spacious living environments. So people are living really close together. People's habits and routines are now simultaneously occurring in these limited spaces.
Yeah.
The home has been redefined. The home was a space of rest. It was a space of leisure. It
Yeah.
now has to simultaneously be a space of rest, leisure, play for the child, entertainment, and office.
Yeah.
And it has to be this for husband and wife both
Yeah.
in many cases. So,
Right.
so this is creating massive stresses, massive tension. It's making everyday life a little more fatiguing than you would imagine. So while on the one hand, we imagine that life is more sedentary, we don't have to commute so much, we're saving all that energy and that time. But I think everyone will agree that we end every day feeling that much more sapped, that much more kind of fatigued than we might otherwise do. And while we will adapt, we will find ways to operate in this. These are interim ways. These are temporary states, which will obviously be replaced as we move forward.
there's an interesting example of hotels, and during the lockdown, given what Aftab was talking about, the congestion in home, the day the lockdown ended in some of the states, hotel rooms being booked by natives of that city, there was one particular brand that experienced 7,500 bookings of hotel rooms from people in that city on one day. And I think it's very, very telling in terms of how imprisoned, how stifled you felt. So again, a new business opportunity, right? Like hotels think of people who are travelers as their audience, but probably there's another opportunity.
I
Privacy.
want to break free.
Privacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, the human contact, the eye contact, getting responses from people and modulating your response. That also in this staring at a blank screen and doing a session. I mean, I really feel imprisoned.
In fact, Kaustubh, that probably is a good segue into our next mental model, which is the deprived mind.
Yeah.
You could have that image. The deprived mind is actually very interesting, a little different from the imprisoned mind. This actually is about a massive sensory deprivation that, as people, we've experienced in the last few months. And if you think about it, in the last maybe 20 years, India has become a consuming society. We've become a consumerist society. Consumption has become a big part of our daily lives. It's a powerful feeling of identity crafting. And suddenly, this has been snatched away from you. This has been denied. And by the way, this is not purely a lockdown phenomenon. I mean, if you consider the recessionary environment that we are entering, this denial of consumption is going to be a possible long-lasting reality. And what this all means is that this kind of deprivation that consumers go through could mean that, I mean, this is an image of people, middle class consumers, having to go to a ration shop to buy their produce and supplies, and that is a downgraded experience, right? I mean, earlier there was the pride of being able to go to a neighborhood store, or even buy certain kinds of brands. We've met and come across a number of stories where people are talking about this really inescapable feeling of sliding back into poverty and being deprived of pathway into progress, or the lifestyle experiences that they probably assumed was coming in. So that is really what the deprivation mindset is about.
Yeah. So a breakaway from the kind of mindset of abundance.
Yeah.
I can get this in the last minute.
Yeah,
I can, whenever. Yeah.
Also,
But
Kaustubh, like,
one-
so you've redefined touch for me. It has to be contactless. You've redefined smell for me because I have to wear a mask. You've redefined movement for me because I can only go to some places and I can't go to others. And I think so. For instance, just as businesses, so what do the visually impaired do? And is there need for new narratives there, or the fact that, like, how do you substitute experiences of touch and smell through other senses, or how do you dial up, how do you create those experiences in an environment that is so deprived?
Right. Yeah.
These are very important questions for brands to think of.
Right.
But that small example of the Dalgona coffee image that you saw earlier
Yeah.
was actually, this went viral in a crazy
Oh, yeah,
way.
yeah,
What it was actually people being able to replicate a barista experience in a very simple way in home. I mean, people are really aching for those kinds of sensory experiences. And this is probably going to be an era where you'll see an opportunity for brands that are able to create this possibility of bringing in those experiences in home.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, indulgence is going to need to be delivered by F&B,
Right.
because that's going to be one of the few avenues where you can actually experience a dopamine hit.
Yeah.
So I mean, with other avenues closed off, it's going to be crucial.
Yeah. Very interesting point. So yeah. So how do you give kind of indulging messages to users?
Yeah, and
Indulgent messages, so to say.
how do you compensate for sensory deprivation?
Correct. Yeah.
Through innovation.
All right. Yeah. What's the next?
Next, we've got the worrying mind. So the worrying mind is, in some senses, similar to the panic mind, but different. It's a played out version of panic, maybe less so panic, but it's about a sustained experience of anxiety. It's stemming from this inability to get this operation in a state of the unknown. So you have no clarity about when this will end. You have no clarity about how this will end. You don't know if you're going to have a job. You don't know what your income is going to be in the next 3 months. It is pervasive. It's happening across classes in India, but it's taking very different forms. So in obviously for the mass rural population, for the migrant worker, for the lower economic classes, it's a more elevated anxiety of even survival. For the middle and upper classes, there are other types of stresses. But the fact of the matter is that people in this situation are seeking step-by-step roadmaps towards stability and clarity. So the job of a brand then becomes, or the job of the state becomes, to say, not to just show people a destination of stability, but to say, look, here are the 10 steps that we are taking. And we will tick off these steps as we go. And just this action of giving people steps towards a stable goal is a stress alleviating action. So that is something that brands need to do in response to the worrying mind mental model. And then we get to the last two, which are extremely fascinating. The next one is the introspective mind, which is really about the fact that the lockdown slowed life down. I think irrespective of which class you belong to in society, you had an experience of slowing down. And that experience of slowing down gave people an opportunity to pause, just step back and look at the lives they'd been leading. So whether it is pollution, whether it is a distance from traditions and spiritualism, whether it is just a mindless preoccupation with the rat race, all of these things put together, people have had an opportunity to ask themselves a very fundamental question. What am I really looking for in life? Am I looking for quality of life, or am I looking for quantity of prosperity? And this is a very, very important question. Now, this may sound like a very elite perspective, where we have the luxury of asking ourselves questions about quality of life versus quantity of earning. But the fact is that even for the poor people, for those who have really suffered, the migrants and other populations like that, there has been a moment of introspection to say, do I really want this job in this city where I live in these terribly inhumane conditions, separated from my community, separated from my family? Do I want to go back and never come back? I mean, we've heard a lot of migrants say, we are going home, and you know what? If I can avoid it, I don't want to go home. I don't want to come back to the city. Now, we know that necessity and poverty might force these poor people to return. But are we as institutions and governments and brands, are we able to show them an alternative reality? Are we able to upskill them? Are we able to change their capabilities? Are we able to change the face of small town India or rural India?
Yeah.
Are we able to create localized, hyper-local industry and economy that allows them to stay where they are and reduces the load on urban centers? These are all, this is the moment where all these things are going to play out. And therefore, so much responsibility rests on brands and institutions to make some of this happen.
Yeah, I can kind of think of a situation where a person thinks that, oh, I've given my life to this shop. Say, I'm an employee, and now he just chucks me out at the drop of a hat within a month. So that leads to a lot of introspection. Even at the elite level, suppose you are a president or a CEO of a company, cash flows go down, this salaries are not going to be sustainable 3 months down the line. So he or she also feels, oh, I have given the last decade to building this company, and what does this company care about? They don't. So that leads to a lot of introspection, right?
And Doc,
what you're driving at.
That's what I'm driving at. And Doc, there have been a lot of narratives about sustainability. And I'm not talking purely about environment. I'm talking about, even people talk about sustainable growth for businesses. How do we do this in a responsible fashion? How do we not be purely about profit and things like that? I think today we are faced with a even more fundamental question, which is that, is growth the be all and end all of everything? Is there some other way of looking at progress for humanity? Is there some other way of looking at progress for users and consumers and humans? Is growth the only the measure of progress? Because fundamentally, whether you call it sustainable growth or you call it something else, growth puts us into a framework of cutthroat capitalism,
Right.
which then results in situations such as these, where when you're faced with tremendous calamity, you have to take cold, hard decisions that are deeply cruel. So, we fundamentally believe that capitalism as a global economic model is now really due some change. And maybe as we move from democracy to social democracy models, we potentially start to shift the needle on what capitalism actually needs to be.
Right.
Yeah, or the other way to articulate it is to say, what does growth mean? Is it time to redefine the idea of growth? As of now, for most businesses, it is really top line and bottom line. But are there other vectors by which you can measure growth? And probably this is therefore, like Aftab is saying, a watershed moment in terms of how businesses can actually imagine themselves. Is growth also equal? Is it necessarily linear? Is it also equal to sustainability, employee well-being, impact on the planet, so on and so forth, as opposed to just a very linear and narrow definition, which is very linked in money? So
there's a comment I just saw on Bhutan and gross national happiness. It's absolutely valid point. I think we have such lessons to learn from nations like Bhutan. I mean, I know it's easy. They're smaller. They can control their environment much more. Ours is a more complicated story. Much bigger populations, much bigger aspirations in terms of progress and getting out of poverty. But there is so much to be learned from redefining material progress.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So one last question. Anju, you mentioned that maybe companies might become a little more humane and look at other metrics of measuring growth. But coming out of the lockdown, when these guys are down on cash, will they be really concerned about these things before as a priority over profits at the moment? Is a question that I have in mind.
No, I think it's a very, very valid question, and probably like Darwin's theory, right? Like we need to survive and then move forward. However, I think what it is the opportunity that this offers us
Yeah.
is not to just think of the short term. The narrative that you create today, the opportunity is for you to create a completely new narrative for the long term. So you may have to do some things that are necessary to survive in the short term. However, I think it's imperative for businesses to start thinking about how can they authentically contribute to meaning beyond these linear, probably borrowed from the West concepts of business. And that's the important point, and I think this is the start of the journey. Like we are saying, it's a liminal period, and a liminal period must have rituals that will take you to your new state, and this is the time to do that.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, I think the good news is that there are enough business models out there that have already shown that you can do good and still be successful. Right?
Yeah.
I think to expect the champions of capitalism to completely abandon their ambition is a bit idealistic. But if you look at a lot of the examples in front of us, if you look at, let's say, the entire shared economy as a great example in actually bringing a very different perspective to consumption. I mean, like so far, for a long time, we've thrived on creating individual units of consumption.
Ownership.
As a business model, and while maybe in the short term, the shared economy is going to have a little bit of a struggle with people not wanting to get into the same car as strangers and things like that. But it, in the long run, it brings about an alternative way of consumption. If you also consider brands like Patagonia in the West, which perpetuate the philosophy of don't consume. I mean, it's not minimalism as a fashion statement, but our products are built well enough and they are durable enough for you to not have to buy them repeatedly. You take technology today and look at perhaps mobile phone brands which make you upgrade your hardware perhaps every year, if not more frequently than that. Is that a sustainable model of business? Or is there a way in which brands need to rethink how they can actually help consumers experience growth without necessarily needing to engage in endless consumption cycles?
Okay. So that kind of leads me to think that company valuations need to go beyond just top line and bottom line.
Correct.
So multiple parameters need to come in, and maybe that will take time, but at least the rethink might have started now. Hopefully.
And the meaning, Doc, the meaning of employee satisfaction is likely to change.
Yeah.
And so for the long-term health of businesses, you have to look at a wider spectrum of what you're giving employees. Are you simply giving them promotions and salaries?
Right.
Or are you giving them a little bit more? Are you giving them self-improvement opportunities?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, like I see in a lot of IT companies who are digitally well infrastructured, so to say, folks have gone away to their hometowns. They don't want to live in Bangalore and Mumbai for working in an IT company because they have good connectivity in their hometowns. They are with their folks at home, and living expenses are down by 60%. So, and why not do it? So a lot of reverse migration, not just in terms of the lower strata of society, but the middle class is also, that's also happening. So that's also a point to be noted by a lot of companies. So kind of, I mean, I'll just summarize our discussion before we start taking questions. Aditya, can we get that all the 9 models on one slide, the second or the third slide in the presentation? Yeah, this one. So just to kind of summarize, each individual will kind of move through these mental models at different points in time. And what is it that, as a company, where can you position your message to kind of get the user onto your side? How do you empathize with what state of mind that user is in at what point in time, and time your messaging and kind of modulate your messaging, craft your messaging accordingly, is what the kind of overall takeaway for me from this whole discussion. Uh, how do companies and brands get to understand what mental state the user is at what time, and then create an offering or create the messaging, or also uh, create a new offering, different offering, and that's where a lot of opportunities for innovation also come out if you really look at these models carefully. That's my kind of takeaway from this. You want to add something? We can before we start
Yeah,
taking.
I'd like to, which is really to say, so the opportunity is also to really genuinely solve human problems,
Yes,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
that's the fundamental opportunity, which can, how can you really be truly empathetic with the consumer and meaningfully solve his problems, given the understanding of what he's going through. I think that's the power of what we've done.
Great, wonderful. Yeah. So you choose the questions there on the right side of your screen. Go on, whatever.
Costa, why don't you tell us which one you which there's so many.
Okay. Uh, Sakshi Korde saying, do you think the clay moment will change brand relationships? I think you guys have answered that question through these different mental models, and those are the ones who will actually dictate the kinds of relationships that the companies want to build with their users, right? Do you want to take that, or shall we go to the next
Yeah,
one?
no, just to say that brands that are slightly more fearless and more proactive right now. So brands that don't wait to innovate after the new normal, but
Yeah,
actually take the lead to shape the new normal, because the future is a blank slate.
right,
We're not
absolutely.
predicting what's going to happen. We are saying that what is taking shape right now, you have the ability to mold it in a constructive direction going forward.
Right,
So this is the time for people, for brands and companies to actually take the risk, go out there, find lean ways to think about what people need, and innovate around that.
right,
And
absolutely.
these are the brands then that will build loyalty into the short term future and beyond.
Yeah, also, Costa, just to add to that, it's not about changing who you are, but how you are.
Right.
And that they're fundamentally very different, and that's really important. That you be authentic in solving whatever you're planning to solve.
Then Mr. Ganesh Rane is asking if we were to broadly bucket these mindsets as per top industries like automotive, FMCG, media, BFSI, what would you say is a more relevant mindset to address for each? Do you think
It's
one can bucket it
You'd have
like
to, sorry. I was just going to say, we'd say you'd have to buy the report, information, get that
And
specificity.
no, I mean, and also broadly to answer that is, can we really bucket it like that? Like
Yeah,
an
I was
automotive
just going to
consumer
say that,
will have this mindset. This no, I don't think that is right. So, because
yeah,
a
it's
person will go through a cycle of different mental models at different points in time. So, as Anju said some time back, you have to be really empathetic with that user to understand his or her uh, mindsets at different points in time.
but
So,
but Doc, I also want to say that as a brand, if you feel to center yourself in this canvas and you want to anchor yourself in any one mental model, then we find that one of the ways to do that is to look at the archetype of your brand.
right.
I'm not 100% sure all our listeners are familiar with this idea, but the idea of the brand essence or the brand archetype. So, for instance, to give you a very simple example, a brand like Harley Davidson has been identified globally as a hero brand. Its
Hmm.
archetype essence is the essence of a hero. Sorry, the outlaw, right, Anju?
yeah,
The
yeah,
outlaw.
yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you. Harley Davidson is an outlaw brand. Now, the question would then be, as an outlaw brand, whose entire persona and values stem from a space of rebellion and changing the status quo. Which of these mental models resonates more naturally with my state of being as a brand? And then I operate in the consumer universe through that in a very big way. So the answer to this question is, it's not so much category or industry specific. It's more brand essence and archetype driven.
Right. So
I think
what?
the other lens I would kind of add is that, each of these throws up some very clear and sizable problems that the consumer is experiencing at the moment. I think this is one way for brands to look at those problems, to say if they have an authentic capability to solve those problems. Do you really have an ability to solve for some of those problems? And the closer you are to being able to solve those human problems, the more you're kind of going to be able to identify and pick up on a particular mental model and say, look, this is one way for me to navigate that.
Madhav, there's a very interesting question on, in this era of social distancing, can AR substitute?
Yeah. Just one point on that thing, that bucketing. The way I also I look at it is identifying these models, mental models, mindsets, and creating. There is a difference between the brand and the product. People confuse the brand and product being the same. So if as a company you want to pick up a mindset and work on it, there could be multiple products in the same mindset that you could think of.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's something which I wanted to communicate.
That's a very, very valid point. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Aftab, sorry, you were saying something.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt earlier, but there's a very interesting question on, do we think augmented reality can substitute the touch feel factor on which consumers zero down on buying decisions?
Right.
Yeah, I think this is a really pivotal question to put out there, because I think the way firstly, consider one of the fundamental business models that's shifting is we are going to move away from the analogous economy. That movement has happened, but the acceleration into the digital economy has well and truly been set in motion. And if you're a brand that hasn't found ways of engaging with the people out there beyond your brick and mortar, beyond the physicality of your existence, you're missing an opportunity. I mean, consider, for example, the fact that the retail experience is going to dramatically change, right? Right from the queue that forms outside the store to the limited time that you have inside the store, you perhaps are not going to have the chance to browse and experience products on the shelves in the same leisurely way in which you were able to do it in the past, which means there is a need for you to perhaps recreate those experiences, the tactile experiences, the sensory experiences in other ways via AR or VR. I mean, will it be the exact same? Possibly not. I mean, you can't possibly, create the exact same experience, but can you engage the consumer? Can you kind of find new ways of creating neural connections with the consumer, and in perhaps a very targeted way? I think that's one of the advantages of digitally connecting with the consumer, that you can pick out micro moments in the consumer's life to be able to do that. So I think this is really one of the ways in which the future is going to move.
Madhav, just link to that is also like, see, one is the consumer, but other is also like, think of factory floors. Think of, the back end, supply chains, all of that. The way they worked, probably, I mean, this is the time to reimagine all of it as well, right? Like, and technology is going to play a very key role, not just in, the consumer-facing part of businesses, but as well as what's back end, and there are human beings there as well, right? And so the other big thing to solve for is what do you do about that? How do you create experiences and new imaginations and new worlds for that set of people?
Yeah, even like tourism. Tourism is badly hit, correct? I mean, as I understand, tourism has kind of two pillars, so to say. One is the places that we visit. That is the places of interest, heritage places or scenic places, etc. So those I would call as properties that people want to visit. And the other part is the enablers, the aviation companies and the travel agents and things like that. People's interest in visiting these properties has not diminished.
Yeah.
That is there. Now, but the intermediaries, that is the aviation and the travel agents and the railways and things like that, people are not going to use because of distancing norms and fear of contracting the infection. But now, how does one make the person experience the property sitting in the house? That's where AR/VR is going to kind of come in. In fact, I think the pyramids of Giza, they started a virtual tour sometime in the third week of April. Right now, they're doing it for free, but I'm sure they're going to charge for a more intricate and a more deeper visit later on. I think that's how
the Smithsonian museums have.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Sir, but if you want to think about this idea of travel, and from a human point of view, what is the consumer seeking? The travel always creates memories, right? Like holidays and all that. What this crisis has done is that it has deprived that bank of memories for the consumer. And therefore, the question is: so how do you recreate memories, right? Like how do you create memorability from within the four walls, or what are new ways of creating memorability?
Right. Yeah. So those touch points need to be explored.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes. So, which one do you want to pick up?
Yes, Rohit Joshi has said, do you see a trend of rise in more people taking up entrepreneurship? Interesting one. We have to. We didn't touch upon the self-sufficiency mental model in enough detail, but fundamentally, that is core to that mental model. Where as people start to realize that they're in it for themselves, that they need to stand up and fix their own situations, because there's only so much that a state can do. There's only so much that so much dole or so much handout or so much that an employer can do. And in this context, upskilling is going to be crucial. Even preceding the pandemic, in India, there has been a long-standing conversation on the need for vocational training, on the need for sort of a pivot in the way education is happening from rote learning to digital mastery. All of this is now absolutely crucial. So there is going to be a definite impetus towards entrepreneurship, but are there going to be the skill sets necessary and a credit environment facilitated in which this can actually take shape? Those are crucial questions and challenges.
Yeah, and I think one of the ideas here is that if you look, I think earlier we were talking about this briefly, that the Indian citizen, the Indian people culturally are extremely adaptable. We learn and relearn quite quickly. We've been through many crises, right? This is not our first crisis, and we probably know how not to waste a crisis. We know how to emerge out of it and learn from it. And I think we are quite capable of doing that. What we've picked up some really interesting stories of, people who've moved from urban cities back to rural India, who've worked in, let's say, more modern workspaces like event management firms and so on, who have rapidly relearned and rediscovered farming and have gotten themselves busy. I think we are extremely productive. Just a couple of days ago, I was watching the spelling bee on one of the platforms, and how and why it is that Indians tend to dominate that event. If you look at the last many years, Indian Americans, as they call them, have been consistent winners and the people to beat. And that's come from the fact that we have a work ethic and we have an ability to adapt. We've beaten the Americans at their own great tradition of the spelling bee, because we naturally believe in education, in learning, in adaptability and picking up those kinds of skill sets. So I do think that this self-sufficiency trajectory is one which will have a lot of momentum, and it would be a great thing to see institutions and organizations and the government support this and create space for not just consumption, but to create a collaborated space for craftsmanship. How can I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Tata brand called Oak High, if that's the way it's pronounced, is a It's a fashion label which taps into the craftsmanship of rural India and their ability to create indigenous design. So I think there's a lot of room and ways in which we can learn from that, and we can translate that into great output. And I think that's the opportunity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, another way to think about it is we've always been an country of entrepreneurs, right? 70% of our economy is fueled by entrepreneurs. But I think what this is going to do is to fuel the entrepreneurship spirit even more. So we've always been like, you look at the chaatwala, you look at the vegetable vendor, they're all expressions of entrepreneurship. That's who we are as a country.
There is
Sorry.
one last question that has been asked that I think we must answer.
I was going to take that up. Shabir, right? Shabir Haider. That's the one.
I was looking at the one just above that.
What can the
generation do to equip? But whatever you like, Doc. I mean, whichever one we can take.
No. Go ahead. Let's take both of them.
Okay, so let me quickly address this one. I think this is a big one, and I certainly feel very passionately about this one. I know a lot of our colleagues do as well. I think there is an imagination of less is more in India. There has always been. It has often been given the name jugaad in our culture. So ingenuity, the ability to do a lot with less. There is now a challenge before all of us to making less more aspirational. We have always, if you look at the aspiration ladder, it's always been about accumulate, have more stuff, show off more things. If we are able to redefine this, whether it's as a brand or as a parent or as a colleague or a peer, if we're able to show a different imagination of cool, a different imagination of success, which champions the idea of a slightly more minimalistic take or a more utilitarian take on everything that we consume, that's the biggest thing we can do. And brands are so powerful in being able to shape aspiration. It's not beyond the brand universe to change those destinations.
So it's like going back to the old ethos of, in this Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he talks about one of the niyamas as aparigraha. Aparigraha is about non-hoarding, not to hoard stuff. So so that's what you're referring to. Probably that's the learning that will go down the generations.
Yeah, correct.
I certainly hope so, because I think it's there in our DNA, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
this ability to recycle, repurpose, upcycle, we're great at that. And I think if we revisit history, there's a lot to learn. I think the question was about, as a generation, what we can do. And I think as a generation, I mean, this is a generation I'm talking about the millennials and the Gen Z. They've kind of set a high standard, and I think they're asking very tough questions of businesses. I think they're asking businesses to put their monies where their mouths are. I think you can see through a not so genuine attempt at higher purpose from brands. You can see the ads that are made for the FEs and so on. But I think brands have to really focus on where the rubber hits the road and translate that into real on-ground action. One of the examples is what even Anju was talking about earlier, right? Which was the whole one of these businesses which set up the hotel story that Anju was talking about, where people came to check in. What we understand is one of these brands is actually created a space for 4-hour check-ins for consumers, or half a day check-in and things like that. I think there is a space for modularity as a business model.
Yes.
Don't consume on my terms. I have to move. Businesses have to move away from being so prescriptive and limited in the way they allow people to consume, to actually allowing consumption to happen on the terms of the people or the consumer out there. And the moment we can do that, we're going to be able to create some semblance of movement towards this kind of progress, which is sustainable.
So,
Yeah.
Sorry, Anju, go ahead.
Sorry, so and I think that's a very important point that Madhav makes, because what he's alluding to is the idea of meaning. As brands, what is the meaning that you create for me must not be instructive, right? But must be from a place of empathy. So I need something for 4 hours. Why can't you give it to me for 4 hours, right? And that reflects deep empathy, as opposed to this is how it is and this is the only way it can be done.
So from a kind of business model explanation perspective, I would capture it as make it as much as possible, make it pay for what you use.
Yeah, it's the Lego business model, right? It's
unbundle your services and let the customer choose, which has been happening over the last few years. And coupled with a cash-strapped consumer now, it has to become mainstream. And not just in terms of services model, IT services, etc., have been following this for the last 15 years. But in terms of physical products also, similar models need to come in. That's
Absolutely. Actually, do products exist anymore? I mean, is there a service imagination that needs to come into everything? It's again a question. So it's a time to review everything, I think.
Yeah, true. Let's take one last question from Shabir Heather. How can brands capture and act as a catalyst to the heightened creativity of the lockdown consumer? Can brands think of becoming playmates to consumers now and in the future?
Kaustav, I just wanted to say that there's an entire generation that's coming up with a fear of the outside. And, and that's really scary if you think of it from a cultural point of view, right? Like kids don't want to go out to play because there's something called Corona outside. And so I think
pollution and crime.
And pollution and crime and the rest of it. And now there is Corona. So you can see enough on digital media where kids are refusing to go out. And so imagine the generation that's coming up, right? So I feel this question is really, really critical from two parts. One is currently probably a lot of the adults have forgotten how to play, how to have fun. Everything is serious and everything is. And so therefore, the need to ignite creativity, the need to ignite curiosity probably is one of the important mandates that brands must carry. But I think a more fundamental mandate that brands need to think about is what are you creating for the coming generation? It's a generation that has a fundamental fear and a belief that the world outside is an insecure place. Like we said, it's a watershed moment, and it has an indelible impact on it has had an indelible impact on everybody's minds. And therefore, the responsibility of marketers and brands and governments would also be to think, how do you recreate self-belief? How do you recreate an environment that is safe, that is, that you can play in, that you can have fun in? How do you bring in values of lightness to everyday living? I think is also an equally big a responsibility as sustainability.
And it has to go beyond just messaging. It has to be.
I think one of the things is that, do you have the ability as a brand to be self-effacing? Do you have the ability to make fun of yourself? Do you have the ability to not take yourself so? I mean, really, brands today think they're going and saving lives. Brands think they're changing the world, right? I mean, and we have to kind of like ground us. Yes, it's important to have vision and all of that, but you also have to be able to ground yourself. To say, look, today part of the brand creation is in the hands of the consumer. The consumer is creating memes on a daily basis, perhaps more content than brands ever put out there about themselves. And that's part of the brand reality. And I think if we partake in that, if we play off that, we are able to find a way to make that part of our culture rather than to fight that or be defensive, you'll create a greater sense of interaction with the consumer and the creativity of the consumer, right? That's the other part to the question is really, do you want to create rules of consumption? Do you want to create humdrum ways in which I drink a cup of coffee, or do you want me to play with it? How do you create perhaps rituals around consumption that involve the consumer and that create an element of play in the, tap into that innate element of play the consumer has? So I think there's lots to do with something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So basically, it's about how do you enhance engagement? And to enhance engagement, one has to really understand the mindset from which the consumer is operating, the user is operating. And that's where those 9 mental models, which are kind of taking shape in people's minds, and people will kind of oscillate between multiple mindsets at different times, different points in time. Yeah, those are the mindsets that we are talking about. And how are companies and businesses going to be looking at these and try to kind of create products, services, and messages which dovetail into these kinds of mindsets, understanding when a person is going through what kind of a mindset. So it's time for really, really understanding user journeys in depth to be able to figure those things out. Great. I think we've had a wonderful discussion. Thanks a lot. Thank you, viewers, for being there on a Sunday morning. And I think we really overshot time today, but I was not wanting to cut it down. Normally we end at about 12:10 or so. Great. Thanks, Anju.
Big thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to everyone who.
Thank you.
To everyone who
words from you guys. You want to kind of put up your. If anybody wants to get in touch with Quantum,
Oh yeah.
how do they get in touch?
I think Aditya, you could just show the first page of our.
Or you can just type in a message and it will be available in the live contacts, live comments, your contact details or email ID or something.
How do you do that?
Aditya can do that. If you send him a private message,
yeah,
you can
just tell me what you want and I'll pin that in the comments.
So Aditya, I'm just publishing an email ID for you to share. If you could share that with everyone.
Yeah, that can be done. I can see it in the private chat. This thing, Aditya can cut and paste it in the live comments, so people wanting to get in touch can get in touch there.
Yeah, and Costa, we just wanted to say that anybody at any time, if they wish to access us and discuss this further, we're really, really happy to do that and, partner with people who want to make this a better world and, engineer a brave new future.
Yeah, and we have a platform. We have created a platform called It's Logical. And that's where, people, it's a WhatsApp group. So we've tried to build that community. So after every now this is the third Sunday that I've been having this series, and we leave that link open there. So if people want to join in and have some interesting discussions, please go on. Yeah, the link, I think Aditya has put the link in there.
Okay, so, fabulous.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ever grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, and have a great
Sunday. Thanks, guys. Have a good Sunday.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.